Chapter 2. Location: Southern Utah. Date: June 14th. Jarren, Calavan. Jarren shaded his eyes with his right hand and used his left hand to balance himself against the jutting cliff of sandstone rock, standing at the highest outcropping he could find. His vantage point gave him a clear view for several hundred miles. His search for the last 6 months had led him here. The clues his dad had left on his computer had led him on a research journey of legends and ghost stories, internet conspiracy theories, and unexplained events, all surrounding the idea of a woman who survived in the desert alone, only appearing to save a lost hiker or sabotage an illegal hunting trip. Most of the leads he'd gotten had been dead ends, but he'd finally tracked down a rock climber who'd broken his leg after a fall in southern Utah and barely survived. Everyone said he had heat stroke, but he stuck to his story of a black woman who had brought him cactus leaves and fried snakes to give him enough strength to drag himself to a hiking trail. He'd only seen flashes of her between moments of unconsciousness. The expanse of the southern Utah desert was intimidating. From the top of Jarren's perch, there was no sign of human influence. A line of blue traced its way through the brown and red cliffs. The ground rose and fell in sharp, unpredictable ways, creating a beautiful display of deadly landscape. Even with the sun straight overhead, the jagged mountains and rock formations created shadows that tricked the eye. He'd been exploring the area the injured rock climber had described, but had found nothing to indicate someone could survive here alone. But there was a dark patch between 2 pillars of rock that appeared to be more than shadow. It was green. It looked to be about 20 miles from the tower of rock he stood on now, 20 miles as the bird flies. The distance on foot was impossible to predict, with the ground dropping away to incredible depths and then rising suddenly to create a natural wall. A smile pulled at his lips. After all the frustrations and dead ends, he was getting closer. He could feel it, and the excitement of a physical challenge rose in his stomach. His empty stomach. He'd been searching the area for over a week without supplies, testing the new abilities he'd discovered after Ellie had stopped the pain in the back of his head. She'd opened a window to a part of himself that was connected to the earth. The ground seemed to speak to him, respond to him. His body was able to survive things no normal human could. He still felt the need for food and water, but his body continued to function, pulling energy from the earth itself. He'd learned a little about descendants of angels from Ellie and Treadon before he left, before he knew he was one of them, but he needed to know more. He needed to know why he hadn't been able to do these things until Ellie's touch. He needed to know why his descendant mother had left him. He needed to know what else he was capable of doing. He licked his lips. It had been 4 days since he'd run out of the jerky and crackers he'd brought, but the thirst was not as bad as yesterday. He'd found a small pool of water in a shallow indent and sipped some of the moisture. His bare feet pressed against the ledge. His dark skin and clothes were dusted with the red dirt of southern Utah. It hadn't taken him long to abandon his shoes once he'd left his car. It had been like trying to text with gloves on. He tried to think of what his proper business tycoon father would think of him walking barefoot through the desert. He pushed the memory of his dad to the back of his mind. Swallowing the anger for another time, he focused on the small dot of green that didn't match the rest of the landscape. He created handholds in the wall of the cliff and climbed down as easily as a kid in an elm tree. He sensed weak spots in the cliff, the same way he could sense his elbows and joints. Learning to manipulate them had been a different story. Jarren was glad Treadon hadn't been here to see him at the beginning. It had been like learning to walk all over again. Jarren moved up and down and around the cliffs and crevices as quickly as he could, but the sun had set before he made it to the oasis. He found a smooth rock, still radiating heat absorbed from the sun, and lay down on it. He softened the rock and pushed at its center, the solid surface reforming to give him a pillow. He could have made it to his destination in the dark, but not tonight. There was a part of him desperate to reach the green oasis, to get the answers he craved, but he didn't know who or what would be waiting for him in the shadows of the unforgivable crags, or what he would say when they finally came face to face. Jarren felt comfort wrapped in the arms of Mother Earth, but his eyes didn't close. He watched the stars come out, first one, then a few, then thousands upon thousands. An infinite number of distant lights filled the black expanse. His chest lightened as his mind spun in amazement. It was the same scene he'd watched dance through the sky the last couple of nights, yet he couldn't get over the beauty. This wasn't a sight he'd grown up with. He'd considered himself lucky to see a few stars come out in the sky over LA. Stars were what he saw in his father's eyes when business was good. Stars that he'd watched disappear from those eyes as his father died in front of him. The temperature dropped fast, once the sun's energy turned to warm the other side of the world. The cold didn't bother Jarren until the early hours of the morning. Once the chill made it impossible to sleep, he decided to continue his journey in the dark. He moved only a little slower without the light to guide him, pausing to interpret the feelings of the earth before jumping into blackness or sliding down into invisible canyons. The light changed the shadows from black to gray as he approached the two towering rock formations and the bright patch of greenery protected between them. "Hello?" Jarren's voice cracked as he tried yelling out for the first time in a few days. He cleared his throat to try again. A nagging sensation made him stop. Maybe he shouldn't have announced his presence before looking around a little more. He studied the two pillars of rock. They stood like a landmark or a warning. They were natural, but strangely symmetrical, like the two oracles in the never-ending story. He didn't want to just walk between them. He couldn't see any eyes, but the image of lasers shooting out of the eyes of the oracles in the movie still haunted his dreams. He would get a view from the inside, from above, instead of walking between. He climbed the first pillar on the far side, and then shimmied around enough to peek down through the branches of full-grown willow trees. They definitely weren't a natural part of the landscape. The small valley was a horticulture heaven, not something found in the middle of the desert. The entire area was shaded by towering palm trees with wide leaves and coconuts, fruit trees, flowering bushes, and grass and shrubs growing in neat, conforming patterns. His mouth would have watered if he'd had any moisture to spare. Through the gap in the trees, he caught sight of sparkling blue. Water. He listened, reaching out through vibrations in the ground, but sensed no movement. Thirst finally overpowered his indecision. He climbed down the pillar, keeping out of sight of anyone hiding among the leaves. He reached the bottom and remained crouched beside the rock, waiting to see if his landing caused any sort of disturbance. He finally let himself move into the oasis. The line between brownish-red dirt and the grass was distinct. One step was on dry and lifeless ground. The next step fell on cool, moist vegetation. He made his way around the outskirts of the oasis, finding tree trunks to take cover behind, and ducking behind taller bushes so that he could approach the pond unseen. Nothing. No movement. No voices. He couldn't resist. He walked out from the shade and knelt by the still pool. The water was crystal clear. He could see the bottom, the rocks and the pebbles, the contour of the ground. A school of tiny fish darted away from his shadow. He dipped his cupped hands into the pond and sent ripples across the surface. He lifted the water to his mouth, and the cool moisture sent a powerful relief through his body, soothing his cracked lips. He sucked the water from his hands. It was gone too soon. The small amount of water in his dehydrated body magnified his thirst beyond reasoning. He lost the self-control he'd been attempting to maintain and leaned forward, pressing his face into the cool pond and sucking water in gulping mouthfuls. "If you continue trying to breathe water like a fish, you will make yourself ill." Jarren gasped at the sound of the woman's voice, breathing in water instead of air. He'd been so focused on the water that he hadn't heard her approach. He rolled over and pushed himself up into a protective stance, trying to appear intimidating while coughing the water from his lungs. At the same time, he realized the truth of her words. The initial relief of the cool water turned into a dizzying sickness. His vision blurred as his belly rejected the flood of life-giving water. The woman made no move toward him. She stood with one hand on her hip, the other holding a long spear. A glare of suspicion rested on her face as she watched Jarren sputter. He went down to one knee, taking deep breaths to try and calm his spinning head. His vision cleared, and he took in the image in front of him. The woman was tall, dressed in homemade clothes the color of dried leaves. No, the clothes were made of leaves, somehow softened and preserved to form the garments that loosely covered her upper torso, crossing over one shoulder and wrapping around her stomach. The other shoulder was bare, her dark brown skin exposed. The loose-leaf skirt began at her hips and ended unevenly around her knees. Her hair was left in a natural crown around her head, and her feet were bare. Jarren looked into her face. A wise look of experience and suffering gave the appearance of age, but her skin was seamless, the years unable to touch her youthful beauty. "You're strangely dressed for a lost hiker." Her eyes raked over him, taking in his khaki pants rolled up to his calves, a collared shirt with sleeves ripped off, and bare feet. He rubbed his eyes and tried to shake the sickness from his mind. He couldn't quite clear his thoughts. The aching in his chest had nothing to do with being waterlogged. His reaction was unplanned, the small child inside of him taking over his deprived body. "Mom?" It was the only word he could get out.